Hi, this is Andre. Two of the fundamental challenges that any looping musician has to deal with are, how do you build things up in a quick and interesting manner to keep people's attention? And how do you deal with the content once it's been built up so that you keep things interesting and engaging for the listener? This video is going to look at a very particular technique for starting with an initial loop, copying that loop to a number of different loop locations, and then adding different chords onto each separate loop so that each loop becomes its own chord. And you can then switch back and forth between those chords at random and come up with any combination of those chords in any series that you want to. We're going to start with a demonstration and then we will analyze it after the fact. So the idea behind this particular approach specifically is to be able to take an initial loop, in my case that's generally some kind of beat or groove, and then use that as a foundation that gets heard underneath all the different loops. But at the same time, we also want to have very different content on each loop. In this particular example, they're different chords. So the idea is that you can have that continuous element from the initial loop that you create, but then you can overdub different elements on top of it each time you copy it to a separate loop. So to start with, we build up the initial loop. For me, this is kind of my usual wheelhouse of glitchy, granular, sus stuff. Now we're about to copy loop 1 into loop 2 and lay down a chord while we do that. When we hit the loop 1 button, that does two things. It gets us ready to switch back to loop 1. It also gets ready to close the multiply that's going on in loop 2. Whenever you copy a loop into a different loop location, the EDP basically treats that as a multiply. So by hitting the loop 1 button, we're getting ready to not only jump back to loop 1, but also finish creating loop 2. And because we have switch quantize set to cycle, that means that it's going to wait until the end of the next cycle before it does both of those things at the same time. Now we're about to repeat what we did with loop 2, with loop 3, but this time we're going to play a different chord as we're copying from loop 1 to loop 3. And here again, going from loop 3 back to loop 1 does two things. It gets us set up to go back to loop 1 at the end of that cycle, and it also gets us set up to stop creating loop 3 at the same time, at the beginning of the new cycle. Now we're going to do one more loop copy, copying loop 1 into loop 4 and laying down a third different chord while we're doing that. And now we're going back to loop 1, and now we're actually going to lay down what I think of as the primary chord in the piece. It's a progression in E minor, and the E minor chord for me is home bass. The reason I waited until last to record the main loop is because I needed to keep loop 1 free of any chords or harmonies initially, so that I could copy that bass loop into the other loop locations and not have anything getting in the way. So I wanted to have just that initial groove and no other information, so that there was enough room to put a different chord on each separate loop each time I did a loop copy. And then because I wanted a fourth loop, which is actually the main loop, I added that to loop 1 after I had completed copying loop 1 into loops 2, 3, and 4. So it's kind of working backwards a little bit, but for me this seemed like the most efficient approach. And now we can switch randomly from any loop to any other loop to our heart's content. There's a couple of parameter settings that are worth pointing out here. We mentioned earlier that switch quantize is set to cycle, which means that it will wait until the end of a particular cycle and then change loops. The other thing that's going on is that sampler style is set to start. That means that every time you switch to a new loop, that new loop will start playing back from the very beginning. And in a little bit you're going to hear a spot where that becomes very clear. So as we touched on earlier, because sampler style is set to start, that means that every time we switch to a loop, it replays that loop from the start. In this particular case, it's a nice way to get a faster harmonic tempo going. Harmonic tempo is a really fancy word for how often the chords change. And up until now, it's basically been every 2 bars we hear a chord, and now it's every 1 bar because we're switching after just 1 cycle. And when we go back and forth between loops, again, we're playing the initial chord from the beginning because we're playing that loop from the beginning each time we jump back to it because sampler style is set to start. Here's a couple of super geeky footnotes. The first thing is, you may have noticed that I was doing double-click copying every time I was creating a new loop. Technically, I don't have to do that. Technically, if you're starting from global reset, and if the loops are empty, then if you have loop copy on, and if you switch from a loop to an empty loop number, technically, as long as that loop is empty, you're going to start copying material in there. Now, the idea behind double-click copying is that if you select a new loop and then press that loop number a second time when you're in the waiting state before the loop switches over, then that lets you overwrite whatever is in the target loop that you're about to switch to with the loop that you're switching from. So in other words, if I have loop 1 and then I start off from reset and select loop 2, that's going to copy loop 1 straight into loop 2. But if I go from loop 1 and want to copy something into loop 2 after loop 2 already has content, I'm not going to be able to do that unless I use double-click copying. The reason that I used it here, even though I didn't need to, is because I've deliberately built up a habit where I use double-click copying every time I'm going to copy a loop. And the reason for that is that in a lot of cases I will be copying loops in the middle of an improvisation when I've already filled up all the different loop numbers that I use. So this way I don't have to think about things so much. I don't have to worry about remembering whether or not there's already loop material in the location that I want to copy a loop to. If I do double-click copying, I know that it's going to copy regardless of whether or not there's any old material in there or not. I'll also point out that this technique is kind of adjacent, shall we say, to one of the videos we looked at last month. In that particular video, it was basically stepping through 8 different loops and very quickly propagating different chords and ideas across each loop, all in one go. This is a little different. It's not quite as fast and seamless because we have to think about copying loop 1 into those different loop locations. This is not the only way you could do this kind of thing. It's not the only way you could quickly come up with this kind of result. But for me, it's the most immediately obvious and intuitive. And it's a powerful technique, and frankly, it's another one of these techniques that I've been aware of for a long time, but I haven't really spent very much time delving into. So I'm learning this stuff too, and it's entirely possible that as I keep learning and getting better at this kind of thing, I will find refinements beyond what I'm doing with it right now. I certainly hope so. In any case, thank you as always for tuning in. I will talk to you guys very soon. Bye-bye.